Welcome to episode 81 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode at the show notes, which is www.7, all spelled out, so SEVEN health.com/81.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey all, it's Chris Sandel here, and thanks for joining me for another episode of Real Health Radio. Or if this is the first time that you're listening to the show, welcome, and I hope you become a regular listener. So this week is another solo show where I'm looking into a specific topic in a lot of detail. And this week I'm really excited about the show because it's something I've been wanting to put together for a long time. And what I'm going to be covering is how environmental factors and our unconscious reaction to this impacts on our eating behaviors. So I've always been interested in hearing research studies that look at how the type of music that is playing can affect the amount of food that someone eats, or how the color of the plate can change this, or how whether you have one diner or two diners or five diners that you're eating a meal with, how this can impact on the amount of food that you eat. And things that feel like they should be completely benign but actually have a rather large impact on what we eat or how much we eat. And over the years, through working with clients, I've just realized how much of what I do when I'm working with people is looking at their habits and how they can make the most healthful choices the easiest choices. And it's really not about willpower. It's about making little changes that have disproportional impacts without someone noticing this huge uptake in effort that they have to follow. And I'm not saying that making changes doesn't require effort, it does. And if someone hasn't been cooking and now they are cooking, they have to find this real chunk of time that they can now dedicate to this. But there are lots of changes that someone can make that require either no effort or maybe a small amount of effort up front, but then no further effort, that then makes a huge difference in their life. So that's what I want to focus on as part of today's podcast. And Cornell University in New York has a food and brand lab that was founded by Professor Brian Wansink. Brian Wansink. God, I should learn how to pronounce his name because I'm going to be mentioning it a couple of times through this podcast. But Professor Brian Wansink. And he actually founded this at the University of Illinois in 1997, but moved it to Cornell University in 2005. And they have a website that lists all the research that had been done by the Food and Brand Lab around food and environment. And so I went through this site for the basis of this podcast. And at some point in the future, I'll probably find another resource and just mine through all of their research and do a similar kind of thing. But this was the starting place I was starting with. And they had about 126 research papers, articles on their site, and I spent a couple of days just reading through all of them and saving the ones that I thought were relevant or excited me, and I've now tried to put it all together in a narrative that is hopefully helpful and practical based on what their research shows. And I'm going to put links to all of the stuff in the show notes. And it's going to be a long list, but any of the articles that I've included as part of this show, I will put them on the page. And it will be www.7-health.com/81. If there is anything that I mention and you're interested in getting it and you can't find it, I'm happy for you to drop me an email and I can then send it over. The email is info@7-health.com. So just drop me an email and I'm happy to send it over. So I've created, through doing all this, two general categories from the research. So there's information about children and how they're impacted upon, and then there's information about adults and how they're impacted upon. And while I don't have children myself, I still found a lot of this stuff just really fascinating. And so for parents or would-be parents that are listening, this should be a huge amount of interest to you. And what I will say as well is that some of this stuff may not be completely within your control, or you may not have any control over it. So how your kid's school canteen or cafeteria may be set up isn't something that you can just walk in and change. But I still wanted to include some of this information because there may be times when this can be fed back to, say, schools, and it can lead to change. But more importantly, the research is usually transferable to other situations. So other situations in terms of what will then happen in your home, or what will happen when you go out to restaurants where you may have more control over it. So this podcast is actually going to be a two-parter. I initially thought I'd make it all one show, but there is just so much information to cover, so I've decided to split it up. So this week, what I'm going to do is start looking at the children's side of things and how they're impacted on this stuff. And then in the follow-up episode, I'm going to talk how the research affects adults. But even if you're an adult and you don't have kids and you think, you know what, this isn't going to be relevant, I promise you there's going to be some interesting stuff in here for you to listen to. So let's just start with children. As I said, I'm going to break it down into a couple of different general categories. And the first one I want to start with is advertising with children. So obviously this is a huge topic, but what I'm going to cover is just the information that was born out of the research from the Food and Brand Lab at Cornell that was written about on the site. So we always hear about the problems of advertising to children, and normally it's because this marketing is of unhealthy foods, and we worry about how this affects their consumption. But what happens if we marketed healthy foods to children? Like, does this actually work? Could we get their consumption of healthy foods to go up with marketing? Well, they actually found that it does. And Cornell research found that they could get a 239% increase in the students that lined up to the salad bar when they started decorating it using colorful banners with vegetable characters and fun nutrition and educated videos. So what they did, the researchers explored the use of two marketing strategies to encourage more kids to take up vegetables as part of the school lunch. So number one, they used vinyl wrap around banners that would then fasten to the lower portion of salad bars, and they would depict vegetable cartoon characters. So cartoon characters of broccoli or carrots, that kind of thing. And then number two, they had nutrition education videos that then were narrated by these same vegetable characters. And they had a 6-week study that was conducted at 10 elementary schools. And what the research did is they observed how many students served themselves from the salad bar, both before and then adding the banners and the videos to the salad bars. And in the schools where they just used the banners, there was 90% more students that visited the salad bar. And when the schools had both the videos shown on the TV monitors in addition to the banners, that's when they got the 239% increase, where more students were selecting vegetables from the salad bar. So another way of advertising to kids is to use stickers of their favorite characters. And so there was an experiment that was done with this with a total of 208 kids. They were boys and girls aged between the 8 and 11 years old. And so they had some different stickers. So they had stickers that contained popular characters, so like Elmo. They then had stickers that contained a cartoon character, but it was unfamiliar to them. And they then took these stickers and they put some of the stickers on an apple, and then they also put stickers on a cookie. And what they did was they did different permutations of this. So one day they would put the Elmo sticker on an apple, nothing on a cookie. On another day they would put the unfamiliar character sticker on an apple, nothing on the cookie. Then they'd put the Elmo sticker on a cookie and go in these different options and looking at what happens in terms of eating behavior. And the researchers found that kids nearly doubled their apple choice if a familiar character, like Elmo, had been stickered onto the fruit. And there was no such effect on their cookie consumption. So if they put the Elmo sticker on an apple, it went up. If they put it on a cookie, it didn't do anything. If they put a character that was unfamiliar as a sticker on an apple, there was no difference in choice. So getting kids to eat more fruit with this tactic worked by using characters that they were familiar with. And it's not just stickers of familiar characters that can help. Thinking about superheroes can also be a way of nudging or swaying a child's choice. So there was a study that was done with 22 children at a summer camp, and the kids were aged between 6 and 12 years old. So at lunch, the kids would be offered either French fries or apple fries. So apple fries were just chopped up or sliced up bits of apple, and this was at a popular restaurant. And prior to the priming and the control part of the experiment, the kids would just go to the restaurant, just order as they normally would, and they looked at what their ordering was, and 2 of the children out of the 22 in total ordered apples. So only 2 of them, without any priming, without any encouragement, would order apples. They then had a 2-week period. And every time prior to then eating the lunch over this 2-week period, the children were then shown a picture of a real or a fictional role model. And some of these role models were admirable characters, so they'd have Batman or they'd have Spider-Man, and others were less admirable characters, so the Penguin from Batman or other villains from different comics or that kind of thing. So people that the kids would know or recognize as part of this. And when they would then show them this picture, they would then ask them, what would this person order, apple fries or French fries? And the child would then respond, and they would then note down whatever the child response was, and then the child would go off and order. And what they found was that on the weeks in which the children were primed with photos of admirable role models, so say a Batman or a Superman, 10 of the children, so that's now 45.5%, then selected the apple fries. And so this is a big jump from going from 2 kids ordering it now up to 10 kids ordering it. So what they suggested is maybe starting to ask your child what would Batman eat or what would Superman eat or that kind of thing could lead to more unconscious healthy eating behavior. There was then some really interesting research looking at eye contact and cartoon characters, specifically on cereal boxes. And this actually was looked at for both children and for adults. So the research took 65 different cereal boxes, which were either advertised towards children or advertised towards adults, and in which there was a cartoon character on that box that was then looking out from the box. And what they did is they used trigonometry, looking at the eyes and the direction that those eyes were looking coming out of the box. And what they started to notice was that the eyes gazed for the spokespersons or on the cereal box that were aimed at children were always aimed slightly downwards with an angle of about negative 9.67 degrees, while the angle on the adult cereal was slightly raised at 0.43 degrees. And if you think in addition to this that children's cereals tend to be placed on the bottom 2 shelves of a display while adults' cereals tend to be placed on the top shelves of the display, what this was doing and what the advertisers are doing as part of this is trying to get the gaze to look someone in the eye, to make eye contact, and that this is an intentional thing they were doing. And there's then a second part to this study, because what they wanted to look at then is how does eye gaze and whether a character is looking at you have an impact on your feelings around that food or that brand. So what they did is they enlisted 63 students as part of this, and they took the cereal boxes and then they manipulated some of them using Photoshop so that some of them would be looking down and away from the viewer, and others would be looking directly at them and making proper eye contact. So they then had these 63 people, these students that were enlisted as part of it, and then they were randomly assigned either one of the 2 options. So one with the looking down, not looking at them, one looking directly at the eye contact. And they then asked them to rate the cereal box on several dimensions. And they'd ask them to rate it on trust and connection and attention. And what the results found was that participants in the direct eye contact conditions felt more connected to the brand and were more likely to choose that box over competing brands. So there isn't a lot that you can do as a consumer. Like you're not going to be able to change the angle of the boxes as you walk down the aisles. Like that is set up by the supermarket. But hopefully with time, people can start to figure this out, and the marketers or the advertising companies that are then promoting healthful foods can use this in some way so that they are subliminally pushing children and hopefully pushing adults as well towards making better food choices instead of it just being cereal companies that are using this tactic. So the next bit of research is probably only more tenuously linked into advertising, but I'm going to include it here before I then move on to another area. So catchy names can have a big impact on the foods that a child picks. And this is actually true of adults as well when you're looking at descriptors and how descriptors make a difference. So for example, changing on a menu seafood fillet to succulent Italian seafood fillet, or changing char-grilled chicken to tender char-grilled chicken will increase sales of those dishes. And you can do the same thing with children here. And there was actually 2 studies that then looked at this. And they looked at it in regards to getting kids to eat more vegetables. So in the first study, they had plain old carrots that then changed their name to X-ray vision carrots. And they had 147 students that were ranging from the 8 years of old to 11 years old that were then participating as part of it. And the experiment ran over a 3-day period. On the first day and on the last day, carrots remained unnamed. They were just carrots. There was nothing promoted about them. On the second day, so the middle day in the experiment, the carrots will then either served as X-ray vision carrots or food of the day. And with the research, although the amount of carrots that were then selected by the children didn't actually change across these 3 days, what was impacted by changing the name was the amount that was then eaten. And by changing the carrots to X-ray vision carrots, double the amount of carrots were actually eaten. And when they just called it food of the day, it created a very minor decrease in consumption. In the second study, and this was run over a 2-month period with 2 neighbouring schools, and there were 1,552 students in total as part of this. For the first month, things remained as normal. In the second month, one of the schools carry on just leaving their vegetables named the same thing, not making any hoopla or any big statements about it. But the other school started to use descriptors for the vegetables. So things became X-ray vision carrots. Broccoli was called Power Punch broccoli. I think it was also called Tiny Tasted Treetops. Green beans became Silly Dilly green beans. For the school that then changed the names of the vegetables, purchases went up by 99%. There isn't any comment on how much of this then was consumed. So in theory, all of those extra vegetables could have ended up in the bin. But the likely outcome is that they did increase the intake to some level. So I'm not sure then how this translates to the home setting. And if you have small kids and start calling fruits or vegetables by these names, it will increase. But my assumption, given what was happening here, is that it will have an impact on things. So I now want to cover some of the research looking at kids and what I'm going to loosely call plating up. So this is how visual aspects of both the plate and the crockery can impact on food consumption. So starting with bowl size. Lots of people have definitely heard that tip that we should be eating off smaller plates because it affects how much we unconsciously eat. And this is something that I'm going to cover in a lot more detail in part 2, because it's not just the size of the plate that can affect things. It can be the color of the plate, the color of the tablecloth, the size and shape of glass. Like, lots of this stuff has an impact on how much we serve, how much we eat, how much we drink. But I want to just look at bowl size here in regards to children and looking at cereal. And so the research that was done was looking at how bowl size could impact on how much a child pours out in terms of cereal, how much they actually eat, and then also how much of that is wasted. So the research, it had 69 preschoolers, and they were offered a familiar, beloved sugary cereal in either an 8-ounce bowl or a large 16-ounce bowl. For us non-Americans that don't work in ounces, that is either 226 grams or 453 grams. And what the researchers would do is they would pour out the cereal for the child and they would keep asking them, is this enough or do you want more? Is this enough? And it was until the point in which the kid said stop was where they would then stop. And when they did this, the results showed that using the bigger bowls, kids requested 87% more cereal, and this was regardless of their age or their gender or their BMI. And just because the bowl gets bigger doesn't necessarily mean that all of it is going to get eaten. So what they did is they ran then a second test that was quite similar. And this time there were 18 kids. They were between the ages of 6 and 10, and they were at a summer camp. And what they did is they used secret scales that were then embedded into the table that they were eating off to then calculate how much they'd initially taken and then how much was left at the end to see how much extra was then eaten. When using the larger bowls during this experiment, the kids requested 69% more cereal and milk, and then they actually ate 52% more of this. And in an interesting aside, when they asked the kids what size bowls that they use at home, 78% of the kids reported using the same size bowl of their parents. So despite the fact that they are much smaller, they are using the same size bowl as an adult. And I just want to point out that with this, we don't know how this impacts on overall food consumption in every case. Like, the kid that just ate more cereal at breakfast may then have a smaller snack mid-morning. They may eat a smaller lunch. So we can't assume that this increase in intake is then happening at every meal or the majority of meals. We can, though, given the trend in weight increasing at the population level over the last 100 years and especially over the last 40 years, we can make the assumption that it is these little increases in consumption that are starting to add up over time. And especially as more and more of the food that is eaten is highly palatable, is engineered in a lab, that means we have less of a feeling of satiety as early on as we ordinarily would, and that this is part of the reason why we're seeing that increase in weight. And I would just say that the reason for this increased weight and then the health implications that do or don't come from it, it's incredibly complex and it's multifactorial. So something I've delved into in other podcasts, and it's not something I'm going to go into here, but I just want to point out that we can try and we can make assumptions based on these bits of research, but I would just be wary because we don't know exactly how this plays out in each and every scenario, despite what the overall trends might be. But getting back to bowl size, and what they found in another bit of research when looking at children is whether a child is an introvert or an extrovert can impact on how much they're eating. So as part of the research, they used teachers and counselors to then rate a child's introversion or extroversion as part of this on a scale. And then they got the kids to serve themselves. And what they found was that the extroverted kids were far more likely to be impacted by the size of the bowl, where they served themselves 33% more for breakfast in a larger bowl, compared to introverted kids who were only served themselves an extra 5.6% more. But this, and I just want to add, this was only present when they were serving themselves. When they were served by adults, all kids requested more cereal to fill up the large bowl than the small bowl. But it does appear that when kids are serving themselves in larger bowls, the extroverted kids are the ones that tend to put more food in than an introverted kid. And I don't know how this is going to impact on your day-to-day life, but I just found it really interesting thinking about how personality types can be impacted differently by environmental cues or the situation that they're in. Certain parents may have fussy eaters as children. I know for myself, I was a fussy eater as a kid. I just wasn't interested in food. It wasn't that I was that picky. I would just prefer to be doing pretty much anything but eating. But I know for a lot of parents, it can be a real issue. And there's been research looking at how food presented on a plate can affect this. And there was a study that looked at it included 23 preteen children and then 46 adults. And what they did was they showed them 48 different photographs about food and how it was plated up and different examples, and then asked them for their preferences. And one of the most interesting findings that then came out of this was the number of components and the colors on a plate. So while adults tend to have a preference for 3 components and 3 colors on a plate, children preferred to have 7 components and 6 colors. So they wanted to have much more variety on their plate. And even if the colors were limited, so there was only 3 things, the more components you could have, the more helpful it would be for a child. So say, for example, you are having a plate that has some chicken on it, has some tomatoes on it, and has some yellow rice. If you then split those components up into 6 components, so you have 2 sections of chicken, 2 sections of tomato, 2 sections of yellow rice, and these are put into separate piles and they're split so that they look different and create more of a color scheme on the plate, children find this more appealing and it can help with consumption of healthy food. And the same holds true when you're trying to get a child to eat more fruits and vegetables or cheese or that kind of thing as a snack. So another study found that if you have a plate with lots of different options on it, children will eat more of these healthy options if in comparison to if there was just one option on there. And alongside this research, they looked at cutting up fruits and vegetables and how this can then impact on consumption. And they did this at 8 different elementary schools where they gave the schools a food slicer that would cut an apple up into 6 pieces. And the initial results showed that fruit sales increased by 61% when fruit was then sliced. They then did another study with this, and they looked at 6 middle schools. 3 of the schools got the fruit slicer and 3 didn't get the fruit slicer. And what they did is they looked here at not just the amount that was purchased, but also the consumption. So what they did is they had field researchers that were hanging around in the canteen that would then be looking at the amount of apple wastage and also about how much the apple was eaten. So they didn't want to just look at how much was purchased, but also how much was consumed. And the results showed that apple sales in schools with fruit slicers increased by 71% compared to the control schools. And more importantly, the percentage of students who then ate more than half of the apple increased by 73%. So not a bad result for a tiny little change of just cutting up some fruit. And the researchers, when they went through this and were chatting, they identified there's 2 real reasons for this change and why cutting up fruit can lead to increased consumption of it. For the younger kids, They may have braces, they may be missing teeth, they may have wobbly teeth, and so a large bit of fruit can be inconvenient for them to eat. It can be troublesome. For older students, particularly older girls, they said that it was unattractive looking to be eating a bit of fruit in front of others, so supposedly unattractive looking. I don't know if eating fruit in front of someone else is unattractive, but that was what the older girls in the study identified. And really, regardless of whether you chop fruit up, presentation makes a huge difference. So another study showed that when fruit was placed in colorful bowls and placed in favorable locations, fruit selection went up by 105%. So if you can make the food look good, kids are going to be more likely to eat it. And this is something that, again, we're going to see in part 2 when we look at the adult section, because it holds true. Like, if you can make healthful food look nice, if you can keep it in someone's line of sight, if you can make it easy access, they will be more likely to choose those foods, and through no further effort. Eating behaviour at the table or wherever the child is eating can also be affected by the type of food. So there was a study that was done with 6 to 10-year-old children, and they had them eat different foods that involved their front teeth. So things like a chicken drumstick or whole apples or corn on the cob. And what they found was that these more difficult to bite foods that called on the need for the front teeth, when children ate them, they tended to be rowdier with these foods than if they had been cut up for them. They are also twice as likely to disobey adults and twice as likely to be aggressive towards other kids. And in the study, they found that when children were served chicken on the bone, when they're eating it in a circle, they were more likely to leave that circle without permission, and they were also more likely to jump and stand on picnic tables. So this wasn't something I'd ever thought about, but I guess it could also have implications for the things that kids order when they're out at a restaurant or in some social setting. If you're feeling pressured in terms of wanting the child to be on good behavior or be in control, maybe looking at the thing that they order and if that's going to involve their front teeth could be something to keep in mind. And if it is going to involve their front teeth, maybe chopping the corn off the corn on the cob or chopping up the chicken, which seems ridiculous, but it has an impact, or at least this study showed that it has an impact on the child's behavior. There's then the question of how much food will a child or should a child eat from their plate, say at lunchtime or at dinner time. And this can be a real sore point for many parents who are constantly trying to get their kids to eat more food or get them to eat more vegetables. And what the Food Lab or Cornell did was they aggregated the results of 6 different studies, totaling 326 elementary school age children. And what they found was that if parents are not around, the average child only eats about 60% of what they are served. And more of this means then like more of a third of what they eat will go in the trash. And in response to this research, Brian Wansink had this to say. He said, "It's natural for them to make mistakes and to take a food they don't like or serve themselves too much. What's less natural is for them to be forced to eat their mistakes by their parents. Yet to a loving but frustrated parent who wants to see his or her non-cooperating children to be vegetable-eating members of the Clean Plate Club, 2/3 of the food they serve themselves aren't being wasteful, belligerent, or disrespectful. They're just being normal children." And while 60% of the plate for kids is normally what's eaten, adults eat roughly 92% of what is put on the plate in front of them. And this happens across the globe, or at least in developed countries. So when researchers looked at the US, at Canada, at France, Taiwan, Korea, Finland, and the Netherlands, the results were nearly identical. So this is, again, something I'm going to talk about in part 2 in terms of serving and plate size, etc. Because I think portion control is often talked about, but it often has a focus on willpower, whereas things like habitually using smaller plates or bowls that unconsciously mean you portion out less could be helpful for people here. Because at the end of the meal, the level of hunger that is then rated after this is typically pretty similar, regardless of the fact that someone's eaten more or less calories because of that plate size. But definitely in regards to kids, the expectation, while as an adult it might be that you should clear the plate, as a child, this isn't normally what happens. Eating at the dinner table is another aspect that is beneficial. And I think this is beneficial, again, for both children and adults. With this bit of research I'm going to reference, it is demonstrating correlation, not causation. And it is also based on BMI, which isn't a clear indicator of health. But the research found that the higher the BMI of the parents, the more frequently they indicated they would eat food in front of the TV, and eating at the table in the dining room or in the kitchen was linked to lower BMIs for both parents and for children. And for boys specifically who had more social dinner experiences, they tended to have a lower BMI, especially in families where everyone stayed at the table until everyone finished the eating. And this proved to be the same in parents as well. So as I said, this is showing correlation, not causation. The heavier BMI people eating in front of the TV may also have less money. They also may be eating less healthy food. They may smoke more. They may be in better health. So we can't 100% say that if they switch to eating at the table that things would change or would improve. But considering that watching TV while eating tends to increase calorie consumption, it does seem plausible that it is going to be having at least some kind of causal impact or causal effect on BMI. I think there is also something to be said about just the family ties element and the bonding element that can come about of eating at a kitchen table. And maybe this isn't in every household, and maybe there's some not great kitchen table discussions or kitchen table experiences, but I think typically this comment is true. And so if you can be having more of your meals together as a family or more of your meals at the table, it's going to be helpful. Now, I just want to continue looking at kids, but look at some of what the research shows around canteens and cafeterias. And I know I've mentioned some of these studies so far, but for the things I'm going to mention now, I think it's probably less generalizational in terms of the results. So it's probably going to be less that it's going to be true at home because these are things that are more likely to be confined within the canteen or the cafeteria type setting. So the first is looking at trays versus no trays for collecting food. So some places had started to remove trays to try and reduce food waste, but also in a hope that it would mean that people would eat less food, they would cut down their calories, they would hopefully lose weight, and that was the reasoning behind removing trays. But does this really work? So they had a study that was done with a university cafeteria where they would alternate between having trays and then having trayless service in 2-week intervals. So 2 weeks of trays, 2 weeks of no trays, 2 weeks of trays, 2 weeks of no trays, just alternating. And throughout this period, the dinner menu remained the same. And when they were doing this, the variables that were interesting to them was looking at what percentage of people were taking a salad, were taking an entree, dessert, and then the amount of food that each person wasted. And what they found was that people were less likely to take a salad when there was no tray because it was more difficult to carry. But the percentage of diners who then took dessert stayed the same. So when there is no tray, salad gets left at the salad bar, dessert still gets taken. And when people then did take the plates, what they would do is they would then try and pile them higher if there was no tray. So the fact that they would only have the plate that they were carrying in one hand and maybe the dessert they were carrying in the other hand, they would try and put as much onto that plate, more so than if they would have a tray, because they were wanting to just make one trip and do it with their limited ability to carry this stuff. So what they found was overall, having trays or having no trays, it did lead to a little bit less food wastage, but less salad was eaten, and this was obviously a drawback and something that they wanted to then rethink as part of this. How people pay for their food also affects buying behavior, and this, my comments here are specifically about schools. So some schools have a debit card style paying system instead of paying for cash, and they switched over to do this largely to make it more convenient. But what they started to notice, or what has been identified as part of the research, is that this change can have unintentional negative consequences. So research that was done by Cornell University discovered that students who paid with cash as opposed to debit cards made healthier choices. So those using cash increased the percentage of money spent on healthy food by 30% compared to those using debit cards. And as I said, I don't know how this translates out to human behavior in general, only what happens in schools. Because if it does translate out into human behavior in general, this is rather worrying, considering that there's been a huge push towards contactless payment and just moving away from cash. But as I said, at this stage, I don't have any research on that, so I'm just commenting on what's happening in the schools. Another thing looked at how serving vegetables in two locations within the cafeteria can increase the amount that is taken. So if you have a hot vegetable section and you have a cold vegetable section, and these are easy to get to and they're in plain view, students took 41% more cold vegetables and 20% more hot vegetables than if they were offered vegetables just in one location. And convenience really is key here. So in one middle school, researchers set out to make the salad bar more noticeable and convenient to students. And in doing so, they were able to increase sales by 300 to 400% compared to year-to-date figures without actually decreasing overall lunchroom sales. So what they did, so initially the salad bar was located on the lunchroom wall, and it was away from the flow of student traffic. So what the researchers did is they relocated the salad bar and put it in a position that was perpendicular to the cash register, so the students had to walk right past it before paying. And what they found, as I said, that by just making this change so that it was more convenient, that sales went up by 300 to 400%. And Wozniak, the head researcher on the team, commented on this. He said, when kids feel as though the choice is being made for them, they may rebel or even stop buying lunch altogether. But place the salad bar in an unavoidable location and they'll think that piling the plate with veggies was their idea. And this idea of choice is really important. And banning foods or forcing kids to eat other foods doesn't necessarily work at creating healthier habits. And there was research that was done looking at this in terms of banning chocolate milk. So there were 11 elementary schools, and they replaced chocolate milk with skim milk. And the result was that students took 10% less milk, 29% more milk was wasted, and many students even stopped eating the school meals altogether. So considering that they were wanting kids to drink more milk for protein and for calcium, this wasn't a great result. So off the back of this, what the researchers then encouraged was, instead of banning chocolate milk, it's make regular milk appear more convenient, more normal for someone to select. So like putting white milk or normal milk like in the front of the refrigerator, or making sure that at least 1/3 or 1/2 of the milk in the front of the refrigerator was the white milk. And by making those changes, you get to a place where kids are having more of the white milk as opposed to the chocolate milk. There was also research that looked at growing food at school and how this impacted on vegetable intake. So one school was used as part of the study, and when food was grown in the school garden and was then put into the salads on offer at lunchtime, kids were 4 times more likely to take salad. And this statistic is a little misleading. So the percentage of children that picked salad previously was 2%, it then changed to 10%, and on average they ate 2/3 of the salad. So it is a change, and it is definitely heading in the right direction, but when I initially read 4 times as many, I was really impressed, and then when I read that it changed from 2% to 10%, I was a little less impressed. I don't know how this statistic would then play out if you were growing vegetables at home, and how this would impact on kids' consumption. But I would think that it would increase it, and I would think that it would be more noticeable than what happened with this pilot study at the school. And the final thing I want to mention in this section is to do with timings of meals, and how this can then affect what children eat. So as part of the school lunch program that was going on in an area that was studied as part of this, children had to select a fruit, and they had to select a vegetable to then put on their plate or have with their meal at lunchtime. But what was happening was, despite the kids being forced to make these selection, was that they weren't being eaten. And if anything, they were just feeding the bins with this food. And what they found was that kids were eating in a rush so they could then go out and play and have their recess. And so when they were eating in a rush, the foods that they would leave behind were the fruits and vegetables. So what they decided to do is they wanted to look at what would happen if the kids could have their playtime or their recess first and then could have their lunch afterwards. So the eating didn't come before the playtime came before the eating. And what they did was they involved a whole school district in Utah as part of this. And what they did is they made that switch, and when they switched it so that kids would then eat after they'd had the playtime, the children ate 54% more fruits and vegetables. So we're getting nearly to the end of the show, and there's just one more study that I wanted to mention, and this one is a little more miscellaneous. Like, it's about children and it's about behaviour, but it doesn't fall into the broad categories that I've touched on so far. And this was a study done by Cornell Food and Brand Lab, and it was published in the Eating and Weight Disorders, which is a publication. And what it showed was that women who recall their parents commenting on their weight are more prone to be overweight and are less satisfied with the weight as adults. So for the study, there was 501 women who were aged between 20 and 35 years old who were surveyed as part of this, and they were asked about body image and were asked to recall how frequently their parent or parents commented about their weight. Those who had a BMI in the healthy range were 27% less likely to recall their parents commenting on their weight, and 28% less likely to recall their parents commenting on eating too much compared to women whose BMI was higher, was in the overweight category. So in some senses, maybe this isn't that surprising. If you have children who are already lean or already not overweight, the fact that parents aren't commenting on it maybe isn't that surprising for someone. But what was important was that whether someone was overweight or whether someone was a healthy weight, and again, I'm using these terms based on the BMI, the women who recalled their parents commenting on their weight as youths, the women who recalled this being commented on more, were less satisfied with their weight as adults. And this didn't matter what weight they were. So if someone had their weight commented on as a child, whether they are in the normal BMI, whether they're in the obese or the overweight BMI, they were less likely to be satisfied with their weight and with their body. And so this just indicates that weight-related comments across the board are damaging to body image regardless of someone's weight. And these findings then suggest that commenting about a girl's weight, and I would say the same thing about a guy's weight, but obviously this study is about girls and there's a lot more focus in society on women and girls' weight, that commenting on it can have a negative impact later in life. And so even if a parent is concerned about a child's weight, and that could be a whole other podcast episode within itself, but if a parent is concerned, they'd be better off following all of the suggestions that I've been making as part of this podcast that can lead to more unconscious healthful behaviors and to not make comments about weight, because the comments about weight don't lead to someone losing weight if that's the goal, and it leads to women having more of a negative association with their body regardless of their weight. So that is it for this week's show. As I said at the beginning, this is a two-parter, and in the next episode dealing with this, I'm going to look at the research around environmental factors and how this impacts on adults. But I hope you found today's show informative and that it was useful irrespective of whether you have children of your own. So next week, as always, I will be back with another episode. Until then, look after yourself and I'll catch up with you soon.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.